So, welcome to The Scoop, NANP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson, Education Program Specialist for the NANP. These webinars are recorded and can be viewed at any time by logging into the NANP members area. NANP members can earn 1 continuing education credit for participating in Scoop webinars by taking the corresponding quiz, which can be found in the membership area of the NANP website. Okay, so let's get started. Today's presentation is developing a testing plan to identify hidden mold in any building. Corey Levy is accredited through the American Council for Accredited Certifications as a certified microbial investigator and certified indoor environmentalist, North America's oldest and most prestigious certifying body dedicated to indoor air quality. Corey is also licensed as a Florida mold assessor and New York mold assessor. Additionally, he is a well-accredited professional. The WELL Building Standard is the premier standard for buildings, interior spaces, and communities that support and advance human health and wellness. Levy is an expert at identifying indoor pathogens and strategically sampling, validating, and developing remedial strategies in all areas of a home or building. As a well-accredited professional, Levy utilizes extensive experience from the IAQ industry to help home and building owners design new and existing properties with a focus on health and wellness. Levy has performed over 2,000 mold-specific investigations in the past decade. He has been in the industry. 80% of Levy's clients are individuals with hypersensitive health issues, including but not limited to chronic inflammatory response syndrome, Lyme disease and other co-infections, autoimmune disease, and multiple chemical sensitivity. Levy attends multiple international medical conferences and workshops every year that focuses on individuals with hypersensitive conditions. Examples of these include conferences and workshops organized by the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, Integrative Healthcare Symposium, and Real-Time Labs International Summit on Mycotoxin Treatments. Welcome, Corey, and thank you for joining us today. It's over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. I should bring you around as my hype person moving forward. This would be an easy integration there. Thank you for running through that long list of things for everybody. And so I won't need to go into my background all that much when I get to that slide. But at the end of the day, we're here not to talk about me. We're here to talk about how we identify hidden mold in any building, which has become more and more of a popular topic in recent years as we are learning more on the health side of things, how we can identify these exposures in the body. And it crosses over to how we as assessors of these buildings, as consultants that come in to help patients, making sure that we identify these issues and guiding them towards the proper path of developing an environment that's going to help them heal. So before I jump into things, I'm just going to run you through a couple of disclosures about myself. I own a company called We Inspect. We're a national assessment company that has a team of inspectors throughout the country that specifically works on identifying sources of mold, mycotoxins, and other indoor pathogens. And we help create roadmaps for remediation, restoration, and continued maintenance, specifically focused on individuals with hypersensitivity. Mold Finder's method, launched recently this past year, is the first ever kind of DIY home inspection training process that we have for renters and homeowners, again, specifically focused on mold sensitivity. It guides them through how to assess their own homes or properties, looking for areas of hidden mold and how to assess them and remediate them. So moving into, again, about myself, which Andrea just did an unbelievable job explaining who I am, so I will run through this again. I do have a co-founder of our company called, his name is Brian Carr. You may have heard him on our podcast as well, Mold Finders Radio, and he's a voice you see across a lot of our social accounts. So jumping right into what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give you a quick crash course on what mold mycotoxins and indoor pathogens are, what we're focused on identifying in people's homes. Tests to stay away from. There's a lot of ways to screen a home and to test a home, but there are some that really just give poor data. So what do we need to avoid? The strengths and weaknesses for acceptable testing methods, how we develop testing plans for individuals that are immunocompromised, and then what are testing strategies for the common goals for hypersensitive individuals. Not all testing plans are created equal for the right person, right? Every person has their own need when they're coming to work with us or when they're starting their journey. So how can we help you as practitioners focus on guiding them to make sure that they're doing the right methods of assessing their home and testing their home for their journey? So really, when we talk about microbial growth in a home, guys, there's three main issues that allow mold to grow. One is food. That's really anything semi-porous or porous in nature. Temperature. That is going to be really anything we feel comfortable in. And as a matter of fact, some molds can go even into freezing levels. And then the main and most important one is water. Now, water, when we think of this, many of us flash to a pipe bursting with water coming out in all directions. That's not the majority of the issues we find. Water actually comes in a variety of forms. It comes in liquid water leaks, but it also comes in high relative humidity, moisture in the air, a gaseous form. It comes in condensation, where you have temperature differentials forming near each other, and the slightest bit of constant moisture in that area can allow for microbial growth. So on that vein, many times what we hear is, okay, well, if there's no water, there's no problem. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Homes can still be quote unquote bone dry, but even after a water condition is gone, molds will maybe become a bit more dormant with no active source. However, the colony will still roll in and out of these active stages just based off of the humidity within the air. So removing water without removing the mold can actually make things worse, because what happens is these molds begin to dry out a lot easier. And so they become aerosolized a lot easier, and they fragment into finer particles as they become airborne. This is significant from a health perspective because obviously the smaller the particle, the easier it can get into the body. And the longer it can suspend within the air, which makes exposure and re-exposure happen for individuals within the environment consistent while they're being in the home. So it's not just about finding moisture, it's about finding previous moisture as well. So what type of contaminants are we looking at when we talk about a water damaged building? Because mold, yes, is the hot word that everybody talks about. We've known mold is bad for a long time, but there's other contaminants that we find as well. And it's not just about the mold. There are byproducts that spur off of these different contaminants that we're learning more and more every day that tie back to occupant health. So breaking out mold in a bit more detail, we've got spores. We've all heard of spores. They're part of the reproductive process. And the spores are particles. They're floating in the air. And these spores are ultimately responsible for a variety of different health issues. Many of what we commonly think of, sneezing, coughing, respiratory allergy symptoms, skin reactions, yes, of course, but we're learning about how they can colonize within our body, our nasal cavities, our gut, and cause just general overall inflammation within the body. Now, you've got the second component of this, which are mycotoxins. I'm sure many of you are testing patients for mycotoxins or see these laboratory results. Mycotoxins are a defense mechanism created by molds to protect their food source where they're eating. And so when exposed to these mycotoxins, some of us do not do a very good job of detoxifying them. And it's much different than the spore, which is an actual particle. This is more of a chemical makeup. And when it gets into the body, if our body doesn't know how to bind it, get it out, it ends up storing it. This is where we're seeing a lot of ties to immune deficiencies. We're seeing a lot of ties to neurodegenerative diseases, brain fog complaints, issues related to more systemic body problems. And then finally, we have MVOCs, microbial volatile organic compounds. These are part of the mold's digestive processes. So when molds are in a space and they're growing they're eating. Their job in our ecosystem is to break down the dead organic material and return it to the earth. Now, some of them will produce an odor. You can smell it. It's like this musty, mildewy, earthy, damp smell when it's described. Typically, the complaints around these, particularly for individuals who have multiple chemical sensitivities, is going to be burning eyes, scratchy throats, headaches, kind of more of an immediate type of reaction. Now, the next lens to this, and I'd say it's probably gathered more attention in the past 5 years, whereas mold has really kind of been growing in spotlight over the past 15, 20 years since Dr. Shoemaker released a paper on chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Bacteria has really been a spotlight more recently. It's more what I would call progressive in testing methods. And there are a couple of ways we're testing for them in the environment right now. So the first type is called actinomycetes. These are gram-positive bacteria that can produce a variety of different biotoxins. The significance here is that there's a very strong mimic to symptoms of mold exposure in a variety of different ways. And some of the inflammatory markers mimic those as well. And that continues for the endotoxins. So as taking you back to your biology class days, you know that you've got gram-positive bacteria and gram-negative bacteria. So as these gram-negative bacteria in the environment die off, they shed this endotoxin that's in the cell wall. These can cause a high inflammatory response as well. So when we're looking at these buildings in general, we're looking at both of these organisms and having to develop action plans for removal of both, not just the organism itself, the spores of bacteria, but also the biotoxins that they're creating. So how do these different contaminants within the environment ultimately affect the building holistically? Easiest way to think of this is breaking the building out into 3 different levels of an indoor environment. The first is the top level, the central heating systems, the ventilation systems, the HVAC, however you refer to it, the lungs of our home. This is a distribution highway that moves air and recirculates air throughout the building, and typically coming from higher points within the environment or being blown up into the air from floor vents as well. The second is the middle aspect of the building, the structural components, walls and windows, and areas where mold can hide within these interstitial spaces, yet move contaminants still within to the general living areas. And then finally is the bottom level. This is where the dust settles out. And as the saying goes, right, what goes up must eventually come down. We still are talking about particles in many cases, or these different contaminants and biotoxins that can hitchhike on these particulates that eventually over time will move down onto surfaces. And as we move things around or shuffle through the environment, we're re-aerosolizing all of these different contaminants that are coming from these different levels back into our breathing zone, and that's how we can ultimately be impacted by them. So the breathing zone ultimately is what we call dispersion, right? That's how these different sources are moving these contaminants, the byproducts from where they're growing, into the general area where they can impact us. We take 20,000 breaths a day. So we're constantly having this struggle of making sure that we're getting that good air in, but also our body trying to defend ourselves from whatever contaminants are within that air. And so if we have these different toxins within the environment and these ultrafine particles, they can many times bypass our natural defense mechanisms as these things move into the general breathing zone areas. So in order to identify how these different areas are impacting us holistically, when we come into an environment, we need to sample to identify where these areas are. Just as practitioners, you're going to go through and sample a body to understand how the body's being impacted for a variety of different ways. We as consultants need to do the same. There's a number of reasons why we sample. Obviously, the first to confirm what we're seeing. Sometimes it's going to be quite obvious that there is a contamination within the area, but sometimes it can be a subtle sign of a problem, but not as obvious of an issue, and we need to understand what it and confirm that. The second is to understand how these sources, where the molds are actually growing, or these contaminants, and how they're pushing their byproducts into the general living areas. So thinking of those levels again, how are these contaminants ultimately entering the breathing zone? Then we use that information from the inspection process that we perform and the testing that we perform to write the appropriate remedial strategy on how to get rid of those sources where the contaminants are growing, and then cleanse out their byproducts throughout the general living areas. And then ultimately, from a hypersensitive individual's perspective, understanding the potential exposures within the environment, it can be an important part of making sure that their practitioners are up to speed on what is in their environment. This may dictate treatments of modality and also what makes sense from a plan of detoxification or what have you that the practitioner has them on. Now, there are a ton of different ways to test a home. Really, anybody can test an environment. Homeowners can do it on their own. Renters can do it on their own. You could hire somebody to come into your environment and hire a company like us. And then there are these different at-home tests that can be utilized to understand and what we call screen test a home. So there are groupings or three main ones, I should say, that we hear a lot of that can be quite misleading if they're either isolated on their own or just done holistically and collected and proper. The first, and I'd say the biggest offender, are ambient air samples. There are companies out there that will sell these little testing pumps that you can get in the mail, and they ship it out to the homeowner or the renter, and they tell them to go throughout their house and take a bunch of random air samples. The problem here is that air is variable. It's constantly changing. So by taking an air sample in the center of a room, you can run that air sample at 1 minute and come back 10 minutes later, and the air will be a completely different quality based off what's going on. Furthermore, these air samples only detect spores, big spores that are released from these different source areas. But as we've been talking, and we're explaining here, these spores break and they fragment. These air samples cannot detect that. Another big problem here is that they don't identify source of problems, meaning that if you take a sample in the center of a room and it comes back as an issue, where in that room is the problem located? And furthermore, these spores can float freely throughout the environment. So you can have a mold problem inside of a bathroom and take an air sample in the room next door and have an issue. It's not like that spore knows that it should only stay in the bathroom. They float freely throughout the house. So sometimes when we see these, you have individuals who come back with problems and say, hey, look, I've got a mold issue in this room. I could see it on the air sample, but there's no sign of an issue within that environment. And then finally, the biggest issue here is just the false negativity of these samples. We actually ran a study for an entire year across hundreds of inspections that we performed. We took an air sample in the center of a room, and then we took an air sample inside of a wall cavity where we knew a problem to exist. Just over 70% of the time, we found that the air sample in the center of the room showed no issue in that room, yet there was a mold problem 6 feet or less away in that same room. And again, this ties down to a number of different ways that buildings breathe, temperature, humidity, and the way that these samples are collected. So ambient air samples are not the way to go from a homeowner or renter perspective for understanding if there's a problem. The second are petri dishes or plates, or petri plates. These are what they look like, the gel down at the bottom of the petri dish, and people put them out throughout their home. And this is supposed to detect if there's a problem within that area. Same issue applies here. Spores float randomly, so it's only going to detect settlement. The spore needs to come to the petri dish and land on that petri dish. Again, these can only detect spores. They don't detect fragments of spores. And they only detect viable mold spores, meaning mold spores that have the ability to grow. Again, a lot of these issues that we see are from previous water damaged conditions within an environment, which ultimately is going to cause dried out spores or fragmented spores and not allow for these molds to grow on a particular petri dish within the area. And then finally, the volume of growth can be quite misleading. Many times when they finally do detect mold on these different Petri dishes, the mold growth there can cause for some concern, and really, from a visual perspective, make it look quite a large issue within that environment. So we tend to gear people away from that as well. And then finally, you have Hurts Me Too. Now, Hurts Me Too is actually a great study. We utilize it all the time, but isolated on its own, it can be a bit misleading. So first off, Hurts Me Too was created by Dr. Richie Shoemaker as a tool to understand if individuals diagnosed with SIRS should be in an environment, or if that environment is not safe for them to be habitating. So it's based off of 5 mold species that were pulled out of the ERMI sample, ERMI, which we'll talk about later. And this is looking at the different types of molds found within that environment, and ultimately the quantity of mold species of those spores. The problem here is we're only looking at 5 mold species out of millions, obviously. Now, while these are strewn across common water damage molds from the ERMI panel, it still is zoned in smaller scale. And many times what we see from Hurts Me Too is that we see a score indicating no issue, yet there is actually a number of problems within the environment. And so sometimes, particularly if you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have SIRS, only looking at a Hurts Me Too score can be quite misleading. So we talk about what doesn't work. Let's talk about what does work, right? So now that we've talked about these different sample types, what we call kind of screening a home, there are ways to test, but everything has its own gray area, and they're kind of broken into different categories. So now I'm going to discuss with you how these different inspectors, or even an individual on their own, should be considering sourcing or identifying problems within the environment. The first category of sample type are called source area samples. This is where we use targeted air sampling or surface sampling. So targeted means actually sticking a tube inside of a wall cavity or utilizing an air pump specifically directed at an area where the inspector or individual assumes there to be a mold problem based off the inspection process. The second is a surface sample, visual aspects of mold or a contaminant on a surface, and they utilize a sterile swab or tape or a bulk sample from that area to analyze it. The importance here essentially is identifying where the source is. Where is the contamination growing? Now, in order to get rid of a contamination in the home, you have to know where the sources are, but just getting rid of that source does not get rid of the dispersion of these spores and other byproducts that the contamination has been creating in the time that's been growing there. It's not like if we find a problem around a window and you remove that problem, that all these contaminants get sucked back over to there and they disappear with that contamination. So now there's a cleanse that needs to happen throughout the house. And in order to understand how these areas of contamination have impacted the home holistically, there are essentially 3 different ways we can test dispersion. The first is ERMI. ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. We will dive much deeper into this because it is a very popular tool right now for assessing homes, and rightfully so. So it is a great data point to use. Essentially, it looks at 36 different mold species across 2 different types of homes, water damage homes and non-water damage homes. The nice thing is it breaks it down to the species level. It uses PCR, which is DNA-based formatting, to identify these molds. So it's a very accurate test type and really can help us understand what's settling in the dust, in the ventilation systems, being passed around the home, and ultimately getting into our breathing zone area and impacting us. The second are MVOC testing, microbial volatile organic compounds. So we talked about that digestive process, the musty odors that some people can detect. We can actually test for those in the environments, as well as testing for the actinobacteria within the home. So actinobacteria, looking in the settlement of the dust. Similarly, from an ERMI sample, we're looking for species of molds. This is looking for species of bacteria throughout and how those are settling throughout the home. Now, the final layer here is understanding biotoxin exposure. So testing for the defense mechanism from the mold, the mycotoxins, as well as testing for the endotoxin shed during bacterial death. Now, all of these different test types do not need to be collected from every single type of home we walk into. At the end of the day, goals are extremely important in our process. Right? It's not just about coming in and taking tests. Anybody, as I mentioned before, can collect any of these tests, but it's why are we collecting them? Where are we collecting them from based off the inspection? And then what are we doing with that information afterwards? What's the end goal here? So what we took some time to do is break the common profiles of individuals who reach out to us into 4 really groupings and categories of most common. You have the renter. When a renter calls in, there's really 3 reasons why they call. They want to stay, they want to leave, or there's a litigation going on. A homeowner typically is calling in because they either want to stay within the home or they want to leave. And then you've got the new person looking for a home. So how do they find a healthy environment? And then, unfortunately, for some people, what needs to happen in an insurance case or a litigation case? How do we maximize the amount of coverage by building the appropriate plan? Now, the lens here for all of this is hypersensitivity, right? We're going to be focused on what really makes sense for the clientele that is most impacted by these exposures. So we're going to break into these ones individually and give you an idea of what type of sample plans really makes the most sense. So we look at the renter. Obviously, there is an aspect of financial issue that we need to look here. The renter doesn't own the home, okay? So an investment here needs to be considered when looking at what makes the most sense for them. Anytime a renter calls in, the first thing that we have to talk to them about is, what do you want to do? Do you want to leave? Do you want to stay? Or are you in the middle of a litigation case? Because that's going to dictate the suggestions that we may utilize to talk them through. Now, if the answer is, I want to leave, before investing anything, we always talk to them about, have you just spoke to your landlord or management company about getting out? I'd say probably 60 to 70% of the people say, yes, I have. They will not let me out of my lease. They don't believe there's a problem there. Okay. So unfortunately, they have to invest a bit of money here in order to get them out, because they don't trust the fact that the management or landlord is going to have their best interest in the process of putting together an action plan that's going to be focused on them specifically and any hypersensitivities that they may have. So when we're looking at it leaving, really, we just need to prove that there's a problem there. Many times what you'll see these landlords do is they will come into the environment with either like a super or something and say, there's no issues here. There's no problems. We're not letting you out your lease. So really just identifying the source is a minimum baseline here that they're going to need to do. There is mold underneath here. That's the air and surface samples that are needing to prove where these problems are. Now, when we talk about hypersensitivity, which in these type of sample plans can be more costly, right? When you talk about speciating molds through dispersion and understanding biotoxin load within the environment, this is a lot more sensitive a test type and ultimately comes with a higher price tag. But if the individual within the rental wants to understand whether they should take certain contents or what they've been exposed to, this is great data to have to help them make those determinations on next steps. Ultimately, what we're trying to do there is just give enough data at a lowest cost possible for them so they can get their final goal of getting out of the lease. The next one is staying. Look, particularly right now, in a crazy type of housing market that's going on, people want to stay. Some people love their place too, right? It's hard enough to find a place. And so when we're looking at staying within the environment, we really want to make sure that, number one, we're identifying the sources for them. Number two, we're understanding how those sources are dispersing. So it's about removing source, cleansing the home holistically. And then finally, of course, depending on that person's hypersensitivities and health concerns, biotoxin biotoxin testing is recommended for those mycotoxins, because that could change the overall holistic cleanse that goes on within the environment. And then finally, litigation. It's a full sweep here. We're going to dive deeper into how to develop the litigation, but essentially goes with the idea of cause, effect. How is the source of the problem, the cause of the issue in the environment, affecting the home holistically, and ultimately affecting the exposure of the individuals? So understanding where that source is, how those sources contaminants are moving throughout the home, and how are those contaminants impacting the renter. Now, when we talk about the homeowner, it's a bit of a different type of scenario here, because if a homeowner calls in and they want to leave, from a financial perspective, it doesn't really make sense for them to hire a company to come out and find a bunch of sources that they're then going to need to either handle and remediate, or at the end of the day, disclose to whoever's coming in to buy the property, because that's obviously going to devalue the home. Now, I know it's an unfortunate scenario and there is a bit of a responsibility here, but at the end of the day, many homeowners don't want to go through that process. So when we're talking about hypersensitivity, we ultimately need to know what's being dispersed throughout the home anyways, what's on our contents, what is moving in throughout the house, so that we can, number one, understand exposure, and that could be taken back to the practitioner. And number two, what do we do with our stuff? What should we be bringing with? What should we not? Now, when they're staying within the environment, don't need to beat this down here. We obviously get it. You have to identify the source, and then you also need to know the dispersion and the toxic load within the environment, so we can set the appropriate remedial strategy. Now, when we talk about a new home seeker, there's kind of a three-prong approach here. And the reason is because to go in and test every new place that they walk into does not make any sense. It's not, let's go and ERMI sample every single home that you walk into. Financially, doesn't make sense. And then furthermore, they're always going to find a problem. I'll almost guarantee it that anytime they do an ERMI, there's going to be something, because mold is ubiquitous and most homes have some degree of mold. Now, obviously, there's a variation here in the some degrees. Some are worse than others, right? But at the end of the day, they're likely going to see something. So it's a matter of understanding how many something are okay with, right? So the first thing that we're going to do, phase one, is use our eyes. We developed Mold Finder's method specifically for this reason, to help new home seekers and occupants within these environments look around certain areas and just visually see where potential problems are. If they walk into a new home and they find 15 different areas that have some sort of visual water damage or issue, does it really make sense in investing in any type of testing at that point? Now, for some people, they may say, this is the best house ever and I want to be here. It's in the perfect location. Okay, fine, that can be considered. But for most hypersensitive people, walking into a house with 15 different source areas that they've just identified is probably not the best to take that next step and test the environment. Now, let's say they go in and they visually look around and they find maybe one or two areas that they see issues. At that point, it's going to make more sense to test for dispersion and biotoxin load within the environment. Doing ERMI sampling, test for mycotoxins, test for actinobacteria, understand what the load is within the environment. This can give some key indications and points as to how significant of an issue is based off these different types of species that are identified. Now, if at that point the levels are off the chart, there's all these different types of mold species that are bad, the mycotoxins are heavy, we haven't at that point invested in source identification. We've only really just ruled out that this is probably not the right path. But we get some results back on the other coin here that are okay, that maybe there's some problems here or there, but ultimately it's a project that the new home seeker can either negotiate with the landlord on, or on their own if they're buying the place or willing to invest in fixing those problems. At that point is when source testing would make sense. Going through, doing a very thorough inspection with an inspection company, or following Mold Finder's method, where they're sourcing with air and surface samples, identifying each of the different problems and setting the appropriate remediation strategy around those areas. This is going to save a lot of time. It's going to save a lot of finance and financial resource, and making sure that they're getting into an environment that really is best bet for them moving forward. Now, the final is the insurance and litigation game plan. I got my cousin Vinny here to help me out through this process. Love this movie. He's Joe Pesci, and this is just amazing. So really, when you're looking at the actual game plan with insurance, it's kind of like a litigation case as well. They go hand in hand. Ultimately, you need to prove to the insurance company as well that the problem in your house is something that they're responsible for covering. At the end of the day, it is called an insurance company. They are a business. And so they're going to have limitations on what the coverage is. So the first thing that we need to prove through this process is cause, whether it is a litigation due to health or a insurance claim to an insurance company. You have to prove the source in the home. You have to understand how that source is affecting and cross-contaminating the general living areas and exposing the occupants. And then ultimately how that exposure is affecting and impacting health of the occupants. And this is where the practitioner comes into play here, right? At the end of the day, the practitioner needs to be the one who helps tie that. The data is there, then it's about testing to understand. So to break that out, at the end of the day, from an insurance perspective, with the insurance companies, it's best to do all three. But as you've seen in these different areas, it's optional to kind of do the last health impact. Again, mostly because insurance companies really don't care about the health implications of the individuals. It's not in their contract. They are there to know, did this water event that occurred ultimately cause a mold problem, a source of mold that has then impacted the home holistically? And now for our hypersensitive individuals, we want to take that next step to the biotoxin and realm and really understand what's going on holistically from a toxic load perspective. But at the end of the day, having that information for the insurance company may not dictate or change anything other than the fact that the fact that they exist, right? It's not like mycotoxin remediation is a covered part of policy. Now, when you're in a litigation case and you're trying to string all these things together, let's say due to negligence, due to some sort of issue, and ultimately the individuals in the environment are unfortunately impacted from a health perspective, we need to find out where the mold is, where the bacteria, the contamination is located, how it's moving throughout the home, the effect, the exposure, and ultimately how that is impacting the environment. So if there are mycotoxins in the home and there's a mycotoxin done on the patient, well, there can be a more direct tie. And from a judge's perspective, a jury's perspective, seeing that staircase of here's where it is, here it is all over the place, here's how its body gives them the information they need to make their decision on helping the individual who's been impacted here. So these plans that I just went over are excellent when we talk about the process for an inspector coming out, right? Somebody who is going to help really break down what's going on. These plans that I just reviewed are best suited when you bring in an inspection company to follow them, right? Now, as I mentioned, we have ways for helping people do this on your own, but at the end of the day, it really does make sense to bring in a company that has the experience to help identify as many sources within the environment as possible. But before many times clients get to us, they are told by a practitioner, by a friend sometimes, hey, do you think that mold can be an issue in the home? Whether it's a clinical test showing mycotoxins or certain markers in the body, it can sometimes be a tough pill to swallow. And I'm sure as many of you have experienced, one that ultimately some people don't want to hear. And so some of the next best steps in that process is, how do we just screen the home to understand if there's even a problem here? And the best way right now from a technology perspective is IRM. Now, I've talked about it a couple points throughout this presentation, but I want to break it out in detail here. ERMI was created by the EPA as a study. It stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. It was a tool that they used where they evaluated around 1,100 homes. Half of those homes had water damage and mold in them. The other half did not. They collected dust from each type of environment, and they analyzed what mold species were commonly found in group 1, water damage, moldy buildings, and group 2, non-water damage buildings. And ultimately, they came up with 26 mold species found in water damage and 10 mold species found in non-water damage buildings commonly. And they came up with a scoring system based off of the number of what they call spore equivalencies within the settlement of the dust in the environment, how likely it is that a mold problem exists within the home, and that a further inspection and testing needs to be done to pinpoint those problems. Now I'm going to repeat that last sentence there. It is a tool to help homeowners and renters know whether or not a problem may exist within the home, and that a further inspection and testing needs to be done to pinpoint those problems. So it's not a tool to account for severity. It's not a tool to account for location. It's not going to tell them where it is, how long it's been there, what caused those issues. It is literally telling them, you likely have a mold problem here. You need to contact somebody to find out where that problem exists. Now, there's been a variety of ways that this has morphed over the years because of the strength of the tool. So let's talk about the strength first off. PCR is all over the news now. We've all heard of PCR. It's essentially DNA formatting that allows them to break these mold species into 36 different molds, right? So a lot of the technology when this test was coming out was really solely based upon microscopy, looking under a microscope. When ERMI was first developed, it was very cutting edge technology on being able to speciate these molds. And rightfully so, because it actually is not just looking for the spore, it's also looking for the fragments of the spore, any DNA related to these different mold species in the panel. The second most important part of it is it gives it a historical perspective here, meaning that it's giving us an understanding of what's going on, what's been in that environment, because it becomes part of the dust. Okay. And so if it's there in certain quantities, that source of that mold species is likely within the home environment and ultimately impacting the individuals within the environment. And then finally, as I mentioned before, it's accounting for that ultrafine particulate that most test types cannot account for. Whether it's a full mold spore, a fragment of the mold spore, it is looking at spore equivalency. And since ultrafine particulate is easiest to get into our bodies because of the size, it's such a great tool for understanding how this particulate is moving throughout the home. Now, with anything, there's always weaknesses. As I mentioned, it does not identify any sources. And there is a very large flaw in the scoring system, which we're going to review right now. And part of what I want to get across here today while reviewing this is when looking at ERMI, since it is the most accurate way to screen test a home that we have right now, we need to stop just looking at the score. The score itself has a standard deviation of plus or minus 3. So we know that Dr. Richie Shoemaker and the surviving mold community, when they first put out the paper here, have said that an ERMI score of 2 or less statistically would be best for individuals with SIRS. And now this is kind of grouped into individuals with overall hypersensitivity. That's kind of been the guiding light with ERMI. How do we get a score of 2 or less? But what we're learning here is based off of the way that the scoring system works, a score of 2 or less may not actually be as good of a score as we think. And with a standard deviation of plus or minus 3, you could have a score of 1. And if it is actually a score of 1, that actually could mean it's a score of 4, which is a problem. Or it could be a score of -3, which is a problem. So ultimately, we need to look at the species that are in the environment. Let me give you an example here. So we have two sample tests here. Okay, this is what they look like. You have the top grouping here are group 1 mold species. These are the molds that are commonly found in water damaged buildings. And then below that, you have group 2 mold species that are commonly found in non-water damaged buildings. Zooming in on the scores themselves, you'll see that sample B has a score of 1.29, whereas ERMI sample A, has a minus 1.30. But if we actually look at how that score is derived, what they do is they subtract the sum of logs group 2 from the sum of logs group 1 to give you that score. Now, it's not like when you subtract these molds, those other molds disappear. That's number 1. But if you have a higher load of mold spore logs in group 2 from group 1, it's going to push you into the negative, right? But what you're noticing here is that you'll see the sum of logs in group 1 sample A is a 14.22. In sample B, it's a 10.88. Yet sample B is quote unquote a worse test because it's higher versus a negative 1.3, right? So because there is a higher load in the group 2 of sample A, it's bringing that score down significantly, ultimately skewing it. So as a homeowner or an individual screening the test, this is going to say they're going to see a negative 1.3, and the scoring system is going to say there's no problem here. That's why we need to focus on what's within the environment, not just looking at the score. Because at the end of the day, again, the score is going to give you the statistical likelihood a problem exists within the home. But actually, if we just take a step back and look at the data within the test type, we can derive a lot by the mold species that are there. So all of these different molds that we have highlighted with a red arrow are molds that produce mycotoxins. We all know the impact of what mycotoxins can mean on the body. And furthermore, it's not just a matter of looking at how these mold species exist within the environment, but ultimately how they could be impacting us. So from a practitioner's perspective, understanding exposures to certain mold species can mean different things. And to further that, it's not like the group 2 molds are molds that can't impact us. As you can see, some of them produce mycotoxins. It just means they're more commonly found inside homes that don't have water damage. But that doesn't mean certain high quantities of these different molds aren't going to cause problems for the individuals within the environment. So when you see these, it's best to have the conversation with the patient on, yes, the score, giving them the idea that there is a problem there and that likely they need to have some sort of inspection done, but also diving deeper into what is going on within the environment, what species are actually there, is really going to help understand exposure. Now, what we did internally is actually come out with a way to utilize ERMI and give the information that most individuals want. And we developed something called the ERMI code. We took 3 years of inspection data, over 4,000 samples analyzed from homes across the country. And we took a look at how to give actionable data back to the person who screened it. And so we just launched this here in end of November in 2021. I know this has lived for some time. So this at that time, we've done now added even more to this because it's a living document, as a living algorithm. As individuals are adding their ERMI scores to ERMI code, it's updating that data. And so it actually gives 3 core questions of why most people take ERMI. Number 1, do I have a mold problem in my house? Number 2, how does it compare to others? And number 3, really, what should I consider about staying or going? What do I need to really make those next steps in the process of screening my home? So it actually breaks out how many likely sources are within the environment, what the frequency of mycotoxin activity is going to be based off the types of molds that are there. We are able to screen across these different test types that we perform on our inspections and give the data that people want to see. And so ERMI code has really begun to take popularity in the community and help many people understand what the ERMI code, what their ERMI is actually saying for them by giving them actionable items throughout the process. Now, a lot of what we discussed today, as you can see, is education, and we do a lot of education on our end. So we don't just do inspections. There are not a lot of companies out there, guys, who focus on the hypersensitivity side, and a lot of this information is hard to find. Luckily, you're all a part of NANP, and they've put together an amazing educational platform for continuing education. But the average homeowner or renter many times doesn't have access to this information. So we have a lot of free resources that exist. The first being Mold Finders Radio. This is a podcast that has taken off, done by my co-founder here at We Inspect, Brian. And there's hundreds of podcast episodes on there to date. And it's one of the most popular for indoor health in the Apple community. And the second, you have Mold Finders Practitioner, which essentially is a deeper dive. If you as practitioners want to learn more about mold and issues and how to guide your patients completely free, you can go on there. It breaks out how to read air samples, swab samples, all the different types of analysis, what a good inspection should look like, how to guide them through this process. Awesome information to share for you to help and ultimately help guide your clients. Now, ERMI code isn't free, but it is a process where you can direct individuals to that have done ERMI that want more information. That really, again, breaks down the interpretation of ERMI with an algorithm that's constantly there to update and change and be most cutting edge as we get more and more individuals into the process. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to me today. Again, my name is Corey Levy. I'm one of the co-founders of We Inspect. Please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is up here on the screen at any time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Corey, that was fantastic. I have no doubt that our members are going to love this. The podcast, especially the practitioner one. As many of us are new, just starting out. Some of us, even if we've been in the trenches for some time, there's always more to learn. So I'm loving the idea as well of this ERMI code and those 3 core questions. So I'm going to wrap this. But yeah, that was really fantastic. It's always great to have new insights and just different ways of, how do we approach this, right? So this is really great. I just want to remind everybody who listened to this presentation that there is a vast collection of presentations in the members area. And of course, there is the quiz that accompanies this presentation where you can earn 1 continuing education credit. So if you are listening to this and you have an interesting topic that you would like to present or know any speakers that you would like us to host, please feel free to reach out to me by emailing andrea@namp.org. Otherwise, Corey, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We will share your contact information underneath this video, so anyone who watches the webinar can reach out to you. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody for listening and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.